The universe does not negotiate with enthusiasm. Today, we are breaking down 6 catastrophic scientific failures in California, strictly for the purpose of keeping you alive. This is an educational deep dive into the exact, unforgiving moments when the human ego collided with uncompromising physical laws. These are not just tragedies, they are mandatory safety briefings. Under no circumstances should you attempt to replicate the behaviors you are about to hear. Let's look at the brutal math behind the fatal mistakes. 1. September 9th, 2004. A commercial farm in California's Central Valley was baking under a relentless autumn sun. Inside a massive corrugated steel silo sat thousands of tons of freshly harvested wheat. It looked perfectly peaceful. It was actually a mechanical predator waiting for a mistake. A frustrating blockage had formed near the bottom discharge chute. This jammed up the entire facility. The victim was a seasoned agricultural worker whose mindset was heavily clouded by impatience and a dangerous level of misplaced rural pride. He genuinely believed that a firm handshake and years on a tractor made him immune to the laws of physics. Safety protocols dictated a tedious lockout process and the use of a body harness. He considered those rules to be polite suggestions for cowards. He bypassed the safety gear entirely. He climbed directly through the top hatch. He stepped right onto the golden sea of grain, holding a heavy steel pole. This was a spectacularly fatal error. To understand his impending doom, you need a quick lesson in bulk solid dynamics. When grain is just sitting there in a silo, friction locks the individual kernels together. It acts like a solid floor. You can easily walk on it. But the exact second a void opens beneath it, that static friction vanishes. The wheat instantly undergoes granular convection. It stops being a reliable floor. It becomes quicksand made of carbohydrates. The worker stood right over the center funnel. He jabbed his iron bar downward. He successfully smashed the compacted clump blocking the chute. He saved the company an hour of downtime. He also guaranteed he would never clock out again. Down below, the massive mechanical auger kicked on. It rapidly pulled grain out from the bottom. The structural integrity beneath his heavy work boots was instantly deleted. Gravity dragged the wheat downward. It created a steep, localized sinkhole. He dropped to his knees. Panic spiked. He tried to yank his right leg free. That was completely useless. For every inch he moved, thousands of loose grains aggressively rushed in. They filled the microscopic voids. They cemented his limbs firmly in place. The flowing wheat pulled him down to his waist, then his chest. It moved with terrifying, silent efficiency. In a grain avalanche, fighting back is actually an accelerant. Every single time he exhaled, his chest cavity shrank. The grain immediately settled relentlessly tighter around his ribs. The next breath became physically impossible. Total engulfment took less than 15 agonizing seconds. The immense, crushing weight of the agricultural yield exerted insurmountable compressive force against his thorax. This resulted in rapid, non-survivable mechanical asphyxiation. Consequently, the regional farming cooperative threw out their boring safety pamphlets. They replaced them with a deeply traumatizing new orientation module, strictly focused on the unforgiving fluid dynamics of dry cereal. 2. March 14th, 2013. The thunderous roar of a majestic waterfall echoed through a pristine valley in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It perfectly masked the brutal physics lesson waiting in the plunge pool below. A lone hiker stood perched on a jagged granite outcropping. He was 40 feet above the churning whitewater. He was utterly mesmerized by the sheer beauty of the alpine oasis. His hubris was fueled by excessive adrenaline and a profound ignorance of hydrodynamics. He looked down at the intensely frothing basin. He saw an inviting, bottomless cushion designed perfectly for an extreme stunt. He firmly believed that since the pool was deeply excavated by centuries of erosion, it was inherently safe. he was tragically mistaken. To grasp the fatal flaw in his afternoon itinerary, we must discuss the bizarre science of aerated fluids. Standard river water is dense and incompressible. This density provides buoyancy. It gives you the necessary fluid resistance to slow down a falling human body. However, when millions of gallons of water violently crash down a sheer cliff face, things change. The kinetic turbulence traps massive volumes of atmospheric gas. The water at the base of the falls becomes heavily aerated. It is no longer a normal liquid. It is a chaotic, low-density emulsion of water and microscopic air bubbles. This extreme aeration drastically plummets the density of the fluid. Human buoyancy is completely canceled out. You physically cannot swim in it. More critically, this frothy mixture entirely lacks the surface tension required to decelerate a falling object. It is essentially a giant basin of aggressively shaken soda. The confident jumper remained completely oblivious to this molecular reality. He confidently stepped right to the edge of the precipice. He executed a wild, athletic swan dive off the rock. He soared through the crisp spring air with textbook form. He pointed his toes. He braced his core. He fully anticipated that familiar, refreshing shock of hitting a dense body of water. He pierced the white foam perfectly. Absolutely nothing happened. There was zero resistance. The aerated water parted around his plunging body like a curtain of cheap, wet mist. The fluid was so thoroughly compromised by trapped oxygen that it simply refused to push back. He was essentially falling through a very damp cloud. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. He plummeted through 20 feet of blinding white froth. His downward velocity was barely diminished by the compromised liquid. The plunge pool offered absolutely no braking force whatsoever. He struck the solid, submerged granite bedrock at the absolutely unmitigated speed of his freefall. The impact resulted in catastrophic blunt force trauma. He suffered massive structural compromise of the skeletal chassis. It ended in instantaneous, non-survivable kinetic displacement. As a direct result, local park rangers radically overhauled their safety infrastructure. They removed the polite wooden signs about swimming hazards. They installed intensely specific, physics-based trail markers explaining how heavily aerated mountain streams function exactly like empty elevator shafts. 3. September 17, 2012. A neatly manicured backyard in San Jose served as the stage for a brutal, deeply unforgiving lesson in electromagnetic physics. The homeowner prioritized aesthetics over safety and deeply loved premium landscaping gadgets. He equated high price tags with absolute safety. He spent his weekends conquering nature with expensive tools. He needed to trim some pesky oak branches creeping toward the neighborhood high-voltage power lines. Instead of calling a professional utility crew, he unpacked a brand-new, ultra-lightweight telescopic pole saw made entirely of aerospace-grade carbon fiber. He looked at the sleek black composite and made a tragic assumption. He thought it was just fancy fiberglass. He assumed it would naturally block electricity. He was incredibly wrong. To understand the invisible trap he just armed, we need to look at atomic structure. Standard fiberglass is an excellent insulator because glass does not let electrons move freely between its molecules. Carbon fiber is the exact opposite. It is essentially a microscopic lattice of highly organized graphite. It conducts electricity with the terrifying efficiency of copper wire. Even worse, you do not actually have to physically touch a high-voltage line to be electrocuted. High-tension power lines carry immense electrical pressure. If a highly conductive object gets close enough, the voltage will literally rip electrons right out of the surrounding air molecules. This creates a superheated, conductive plasma bridge. It is called arcing. Electricity simply jumps the gap. Our confident landscaper knew absolutely none of this. He fully extended the pole to 20 feet. He hoisted the highly conductive rod up into the canopy. He angled the cutting blade toward a branch swaying just a couple of feet from the intensely humming grid. He was sweating, but incredibly focused. He made absolutely sure the metal blade never actually touched the sagging wires. He thought this visual clearance kept him perfectly safe. He was actually just aiming a giant antenna. He pushed the graphite pole within 30 inches of the line. The electrical potential hit the critical atmospheric threshold. The air between the wire and the pole instantly snapped into an intense, blinding violet flash. The raw voltage effortlessly bridged the empty space. 35,000 volts of alternating current slammed into the tip of the pole. It raced down the carbon lattice at the absolute speed of light. The electricity found a perfect, uninterrupted path to the ground, straight through his hands, chest, and boots. The massive energy surge completely bypassed all standard biological resistance. This resulted in an immediate, non-survivable disruption of the myocardial rhythm. The extreme electrical transfer caused an instantaneous systemic shutdown of his entire cardiovascular network. In the wake of this quiet, suburban disaster, major hardware manufacturing conglomerates completely abandoned their minimalist packaging designs. They aggressively updated their consumer manuals with deeply alarming diagrams explaining how luxury aerospace composites function exactly like commercial lightning rods. 4. April 21, 2014. The unforgiving expanse of the Mojave Desert hosted a wildly unregulated experiment in backyard metallurgy. The makeshift foundry was operated by a fiercely independent DIY enthusiast. He viewed extreme industrial processes as casual weekend hobbies. He truly believed a pair of leather welding gloves magically shielded him from the searing wrath of liquid metal. He was currently busy melting down discarded automotive parts in a glowing, superheated steel crucible. The molten pool of aluminum was resting comfortably at 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the exact moment where the science of phase changes becomes critically important. Water and liquid metal are absolute natural enemies. Under normal kitchen conditions, water peacefully boils into invisible steam, expanding to roughly 1,700 times its liquid volume. This simply makes a tea kettle whistle. It is entirely harmless. However, if you trap even a microscopic drop of liquid water underneath a heavy layer of superheated molten metal, you do not get friendly steam. You get a catastrophic pressure event. The water vapor physically cannot escape the dense liquid blanket fast enough. The pressure spikes instantly. It forcefully ejects the molten metal outward in every direction. The amateur metallurgist was totally oblivious to this unforgiving math. He grabbed a heavy chunk of an old engine block from the yard. He completely failed to notice the light sheen of morning dew clinging to its cold surface. It was just a few innocent drops of moisture. He casually tossed the damp scrap directly into the glowing crucible. He leaned his upper torso over the vat to proudly watch it melt. The heavy, molten aluminum instantly swallowed the object. The microscopic layer of moisture was dragged forcefully beneath 1,000 degrees of liquid fire. The trapped water absorbed the astronomical heat in a fraction of a millisecond. It aggressively flashed into highly pressurized steam. The vapor expanded by 1,700% inside a perfectly confined space. The resulting volumetric expansion was mechanically identical to a sudden, extreme, high-pressure release inside a bucket of lava. A terrifying geyser of liquid aluminum forcefully collided with his upper body at high velocity. The impact yielded catastrophic thermal degradation of his biological structure. The extreme kinetic energy transfer and immediate cellular vaporization caused a rapid, permanent cessation of human metabolic function. Following this devastating desert anomaly, popular amateur blacksmithing websites quietly purged thousands of casual tutorial videos. They swiftly replaced them with terrifyingly strict, physics-heavy manifestos demanding the mandatory use of industrial chemical desiccants before ever approaching a live crucible. 5. March 18, 2011. A highly exclusive spiritual retreat center nestled in the pristine shadow of Mount Shasta offered a remarkably serene backdrop for a severe biological catastrophe. The disaster centered on a highly dedicated practitioner of radical alternative wellness, completely consumed by the modern anxiety of microscopic toxins. He treated his highly complex endocrine system like a dirty radiator that just needed a really aggressive power wash. He logically assumed that if normal hydration was vaguely healthy, an extreme influx of aggressively purified liquid would unlock a higher plane of cellular perfection. He completely ignored centuries of established medical science. Instead, he followed an unverified online cleansing protocol. He decided to vigorously flush his system by rapidly consuming over 4 liters of laboratory-grade distilled water in under a single hour. He absolutely refused to ingest a single grain of dietary salt during this process. He believed his sheer willpower could override basic cellular biology. This was a spectacularly catastrophic dietary choice. To truly understand the microscopic disaster unfolding inside his veins, we must examine the fundamental biological law of osmosis. Human blood plasma meticulously maintains a very specific balance of dissolved electrolytes, primarily sodium. This saline environment keeps our cells totally stable. Distilled water, however, is completely stripped of all naturally occurring minerals. When you flood the human circulatory system with massive quantities of pure water, you rapidly dilute the sodium concentration in the blood. The sheer volume of liquid overwhelms the kidney's ability to filter it out. This creates an extreme hypotonic environment. Because nature absolutely hates an imbalance, osmotic pressure takes over. To equalize the concentration of salt, the pure water aggressively forces its way outward from the diluted bloodstream. It rushes directly into the body's tissues, which still possess a much higher salt content. The microscopic cells essentially act like tiny, overfilled water balloons. They begin to massively swell. The misguided wellness advocate sat cross-legged on an expensive woven yoga mat. He rapidly chugged his 4th consecutive liter of aggressively purified nothingness. He proudly wiped his mouth. He completely ignored the intense, blinding headache suddenly blossoming right behind his eyes. He incorrectly assumed the pain was just the toxins leaving his body. He was horribly wrong. It was actually his brain running out of room. While standard muscle cells can easily handle a bit of swelling, the human brain is tightly encased in a rigid, unforgiving cage of solid bone. There is absolutely zero room for expansion. As the water forcefully invaded his brain cells, the cerebral tissue began to rapidly expand. The swelling aggressively compressed his vital blood vessels. It totally choked off his internal oxygen supply. He slowly slumped sideways onto the hardwood floor. His vision completely blurred as the intense cranial pressure rapidly skyrocketed. The immense, unstoppable swelling physically pushed his brain matter downward toward the base of his skull. The relentless internal expansion resulted in severe, acute cerebral edema. This massive biological pressure shift caused an instantaneous, non-survivable structural herniation of the brainstem. It led directly to a catastrophic and permanent shutdown of the central nervous system. In the immediate aftermath of this deeply misguided purification attempt, luxury health retreats across the Western seaboard quietly destroyed their colorful brochures about spiritual detoxing. They pivoted entirely to issuing extremely rigid, terrifying legal waivers that explicitly detailed the severe, inescapable consequences of osmotic shock. 6. August 12, 2015. The towering redwoods of the Sequoia National Forest provided the dense shade for a thoroughly avoidable failure in amateur civil engineering. The main architect of this failure loved the woods, but absolutely hated doing any structural math. He decided to build a massive, high-speed zip line right through the canopy for his friends. He assumed that if these giant trees could survive centuries of earthquakes, they could easily hold up a single steel wire. His specific flaw was sourcing his construction materials with terrifying negligence. Instead of buying certified, modern wire rope, he dragged a massive spool of rusty, abandoned logging cable out of a muddy ravine. He genuinely viewed this fraying, mystery metal relic as a perfectly acceptable substitute for aeronautical-grade steel. He anchored one end to a distant trunk. He hooked the other directly into a heavy-duty motorized truck winch. He wanted the line perfectly straight. To understand the invisible kinetic trap he was currently winding up, we need to talk about elastic potential energy. When you pull a heavy steel cable with thousands of pounds of force, it does not just rigidly sit there, it physically stretches. The metal acts exactly like a giant, incredibly stiff rubber band. It constantly absorbs and stores mechanical energy. Every single microscopic strand of wire desperately wants to snap back to its normal, unstretched size. This is known as the elastic limit. If you forcefully pull the material past that exact microscopic threshold, the metal eventually yields. It tears apart. When it breaks, all that intensely stored energy has to go somewhere. It instantly converts into raw, chaotic kinetic energy. The enthusiastic builder was totally oblivious to the physics experiment screaming inside his recycled hardware. He stood proudly right next to the humming electric winch. He kept his thumb jammed firmly onto the tension button. The electric motor groaned heavily. The rusty spool slowly turned. The massive span of mystery cable pulled incredibly tight across the gorge. He wanted absolutely zero sag. He completely ignored the high-pitched, metallic pinging sounds beginning to echo sharply from the taut wire. That terrifying noise is the universal acoustic warning of individual steel threads undergoing microscopic failure. He just smiled and kept pulling. He pushed the tension well past 5,000 pounds. The heavily rusted core of the antique cable simply gave up. A single corroded strand sheared. The chain reaction took less than a millisecond. The remaining structural threads overloaded and snapped completely in half. The sudden release of trapped elastic energy was absolutely devastating. The heavy, broken steel cable whipped backward toward the winch at roughly the speed of sound. It tore through the humid forest air with a deafening, supersonic crack. The recoiling metal whip struck the amateur engineer squarely in the chest before his brain could even process the noise. The overwhelming transfer of kinetic energy resulted in a catastrophic structural collapse of the rib cage. The extreme blunt force trauma caused an immediate, non-survivable physical displacement of his vital intrathoracic organs, ending in sudden biological termination. The ensuing investigation prompted the State Forestry Department to entirely shift their public safety focus. They temporarily stopped warning tourists about local bear attacks. Instead, they erected highly technical warning placards explicitly detailing the lethal geometry of kinetic snapback zones and the unforgiving math of metal fatigue. The purpose of this educational breakdown is incredibly simple: to remind you that the physical universe is actively trying to delete you, and only scientific awareness keeps you breathing. These 6 individuals in California simply ran out of luck. So let's clear the air. What is the most scientifically ignorant, catastrophically dangerous thing you have ever personally done that you only survive by pure, unearned luck? Expose your own near-death survival bias in the comments right now. While you type out your confession, hit subscribe and tap the like button so the algorithm knows you actually value your own